Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us for another MIC Symposium. Today's episode is called Tariffs Update, What We Know and How It Will Impact Powersports. Throughout today's presentation, we'll invite you to submit any questions you have using the question box in the webinar control panel. We'll cover as many of your questions as we can later in the Q&A segment moderated by Andrea Yu, MIC's Director of Media Relations. Today, we'll be hearing from Scott Schloegel, a panelist well known to our symposium audience. Scott is the Senior Vice President of Government Relations for the Motorcycle Industry Council, the Specialty Vehicle Institute of America, and the Recreational Off-Highway Vehicle Association. Scott is a lifelong powersports enthusiast with 35 years of experience in state and federal politics, working in the legislative and executive branches of government. Scott will be joined by Tori Smith, Senior Vice President on the Government Relations team at Forbes Tate Partners. Tori has spent nearly a decade focusing on international trade, the economic impacts of tariff and non-tariff barriers on U.S. businesses and consumers, and the intersection of trade and broader international economic policy. Prior to joining Forbes Tate Partners, Smith served as tax and trade policy advisor for Tennessee Senator Marsha Blackburn, a member of the Senate Finance Committee. Tori was also Director of International Economic Policy at American Action Forum and spent nearly 7 years working on trade policy at the Heritage Foundation. All right, to get us started, please welcome Scott Schloegel.
Great, well, thank you, Lee. Appreciate that introduction. Just making sure you can hear me all right.
Sure can.
Awesome, and you can see my presentation starting with the powersports industry, right?
Sure can.
Awesome, thanks. First of all, let me just say thank you, Lee, for the introduction, but thank you to all the attendees who registered for this. We had more than 1,100 registrations for this particular symposium today, which is fantastic. It just kind of goes to show the strength of our industry. And when you talk about the strength and the size of our industry, I wanted to start out with this economic impact slide to really kind of articulate to you guys the strength of our industry. We're about a $51 billion a year industry in the power sports, motorcycles, ATVs, and side-by-sides. We've got roughly 1.25 million vehicles that were sold. Nearly 10,700 retailers across the country, employing 116,000 people and $5 billion in payroll. So really a huge impact on the economy in our power sports industry. One of the things that we do each year is that we do a Capitol Hill Powersports Fly-In, which is an opportunity for all of our members to get together, go up to the Hill, talk to the Hill about what our priority issues are for the year and the issues that are most significantly impacting our industry. This year we had around a little more than 36 folks who showed up for our power sports event. It was composed of OEs, aftermarket, dealers, trade, allied trades, people from the finance industry and things like that. And we were able to hit roughly nearly 100 meetings on the Hill in less than 7 hours time, as well as hearing from other presenters and both on the House and Senate side and folks who are industry experts out here in Washington, D.C. And that covered roughly 39 states. So both on the House and Senate side, we were able to get to all of these meetings in less than 7 hours time, which is a huge help for us in the government relations office, because by doing that, it takes away several weeks of opportunity or of effort that we would have had to make by going up there individually. And the other thing is that your stories are far more important than just having a lobbyist pop into the office and say, here's what's impacting the industry. In our case, you had folks who are from the individual companies actually going in there talking about the impact on their industry. And that's super, super helpful. One of the top issues that we had for our fly-in this year was the tariffs. So what are tariffs? Tariffs are taxes, right? They are taxes that are put onto imported goods that are coming into the United States. Make no mistake about it, these tariffs are paid by the importers and paid by the consumers who buy those products. They are not paid for by the exporting countries. So when you hear, whether it's the president or anybody else out there talking about the fact that these other countries are paying us billions and billions of dollars in tariffs, that is not correct. They are not paying the tariffs. We are paying them as importers. And what is the result of that? The net result of that is that those tariffs raise the cost of goods being imported for basically everyone, right? On everything that is out there. And so you have heard the president talk about how these tariffs are going to be amazing. They're going to make our country rich again. The only way that these tariffs can make our country rich again is by doing it by stealing money out of the pockets of us as we pay for the high tariffs that are coming as a result of his policies. So this is taking money from us, the consumers, not from China, for example. So how do the tariffs work? Well, this is a simplified version of how the tariffs work. But when you look here, you see that a motorcycle is manufactured, let's say for $10,000 in China, and it's shipped over to the United States. Whoever it is that's buying that motorcycle from China pays China or the manufacturer over there $10,000 for it. As soon as that vehicle lands on the shore here in the United States, it immediately, in this case with China, has a tariff of 145% on it that is charged to the purchaser here in the United States. And that, in this instance, $14,500 in taxes then goes to the United States Treasury. So that's how you're saying, that the United States is getting rich off of this, but it's getting rich by taxing us, the individuals here in the United States. The China manufacturer still gets their $10,000. The US Treasury gets $14,500, and we, the consumers, get the shaft by paying $24,500 for a motorcycle that had previously only cost $10,000. So how did we get here? What's the, what is the reason, or how was it that we got here? 2018 was President Trump's first term in office, and he rightfully so said that he was concerned about the trade deficit that we have with China and imposed tariffs on China during that first term. President Biden then kept those tariffs around during his term of 2020 through 2024. And then during the campaign in 2024, when former President Trump was running for office again, he indicated that he was going to use tariffs once again as part of his weapons. In fact, he mentioned it multiple times on the campaign. In fact, even saying in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, that I love the word tariff. It's the most beautiful word in the dictionary, more beautiful than love, more beautiful than respect. And so we all kind of knew that tariffs were coming under the new Trump administration. It was just a matter of we didn't know how bad they were going to be and to what level he was going to be hitting those tariffs. So how are the tariffs different now in his second term as compared to his first term? Well, in his first term, what he did was he followed the Section 301 and Section 232 tariff process under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. His second term, he's doing things very differently, and he's implementing them under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA as we call it, of 1977, by claiming that there are emergencies like a fentanyl emergency and an economic emergency. So what does that look like in the difference between the first term and the second term? Oops, I went one slide too far there. The Section 301 tariffs and 232 tariffs, that process is very, very different from IEPA. So under the Section 232 and 301 process that he did in his first term, what happens is that the president announces that there's going to be a review of trade because he thinks that there's a problem related to it, and that will determine if there is going to be if there is actually unfair trading practices that are going on. Then what happens is a U.S. Trade Representative and the Secretary of Commerce go about conducting a review based on what the president has claimed, and they ultimately will reach a decision as to whether or not tariffs are justified or are not justified, and then the tariffs get implemented. As part of that process during his first term, there's also under the Section 232 and 301 process, there's also the opportunity there for manufacturers, importers, and consumers to go in and request that some of their goods be given exclusions from the tariffs. And this is a really important step, right? So you may recall that back in 2018-19, we were successful in going to the US ITC, the International Trade Commission, and saying to them, it doesn't make any sense to put additional tariffs on motorcycle helmets, for example, and safety gear, because for the most part, they're not manufactured here in the United States. And it was kind of a perverse situation whereby the increased tariffs would disincentivize people from buying new safety gear. We were also successful in getting exclusions for other things like wiring harnesses and different parts and components and low displacement motorcycles, things like that, that we were successful in getting exclusions under. In the second term here, under the IEEPA process, instead of going through those multiple steps and getting input from Congress, getting input from individuals who are impacted by the tariffs, et cetera, what you have is the president simply declares that there's an emergency, and then he imposes tariffs unilaterally. Just goes ahead and does it. There's no input from Congress, there's no input from industry, there's no input from consumers. He just has the authority to do it. And actually, he is the first president ever to use the IEEPA emergency process for implementing tariffs. So what is the current state of play with regard to tariffs? Well, there's been a lot going on since his inauguration back in January on the tariff issues. He originally said that he was going to impose 25% tariffs on everything coming in from Canada and Mexico, and he did that under the fentanyl drug emergency claim. And then he backed away from that and said, you may recall, he said, oh, these are the worst trade, this is the worst trade agreement ever. I don't understand who it was that negotiated this, but I'm putting in a 25% tariff. He then realized that it was actually the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which he had negotiated in his first term, that these goods were coming into the United States under. So he agreed that the USMCA compliant products would then be only tariffed at the USMCA level. However, with something outside of the USMCA agreement, there would now be a 25% tariff on that, with the exception of energy, which had a 10% tariff. When it comes to China, he immediately put on a 10% tariff, then he layered on another 10% tariff onto China. After some additional back and forth, he said, nope, it's going to be 125% tariff on China. After China didn't kind of acquiesce to his demands. And then he came back a day or two later and said, well, actually that 125% is on top of the previous 20% that he had put in place. So now you're looking at a 145% tariff on all goods coming in from China. For the rest of the world, what he did for them was he said, we're going to put a 10% tariff in place on all goods coming in from any other country out there, and he's going to implement what he calls reciprocal tariffs, and those reciprocal tariffs are going to be based on what level of tariff the host country tariffs US goods on. So let's say that you're in Nigeria, and Nigeria puts a 40% tariff on US motorcycles that are coming in. Just a hypothetical, I have no idea what the tariff level is in Nigeria, but the president would then say, okay, we're going to tariff goods coming in from Nigeria at 45%. That resulted in the stock market absolutely crashing. There's a huge, huge backlash. The stock market lost more than $10 trillion since President Trump was inaugurated, and it was a colossal disaster. A couple days later, he backed off of the reciprocal tariffs and said, you know what, all these countries are coming to me now, they want to cut new deals. We're going to go ahead and instead have just a 10% tariff, and we'll pause the reciprocal tariffs and see what the response is going to be from the other countries. The other thing he did on top of the 10% tariffs everywhere, the China tariffs and the Canada and Mexico tariffs, is that he put in place the steel and aluminum tariffs of 25% on all imports of steel and aluminum. That was a huge impact for our industry. What happened in the first Trump administration when he did something similar was that we saw the price of domestic steel go up even higher than what the tariff levels were on the imported steel and aluminum that were coming in. The next thing he did was to say that we was going to put tariffs on automobiles, and that it was going to be a 25% tariff on automobiles coming into the United States. And that later in May or June, he was going to do an increase on parts, that automobile parts that are coming in. It doesn't look as of right now as though the HTS codes that cover auto products are covering our exports of motorcycles, ATVs, and side-by-sides. So that's the good thing. The bad thing is that when the new decision comes out by him on the auto parts, we very well could be captured on the auto parts side of things, because auto parts are frequently similar to what our motorcycle parts are. They're imported under similar HTS codes as well. So what happens now? As everybody kind of expected, the rest of the world then started to retaliate against the United States for our imposed tariffs that we were putting on the rest of the world. So we saw Canada impose a 25% tariffs on many products, including motorcycles. We saw China impose a 125% tariff on everything going to China from the United States, which of course then makes everything that we export to China 125% more expensive for them to purchase, and really drives, kind of essentially causes a stop in trade between the United States and China when anything that they're importing is 125% more expensive and everything that we're importing is 145% more expensive. You also saw the European Union impose a 25% tariff on many products, including motorcycles. But when President Trump put a pause on his retaliatory tariffs, the EU decided that they were going to put a pause also on their products, their retaliatory tariffs. So where does that leave us now? To help us out and kind of help make sense of this whole thing, we've got Tori Smith joining us. As Lee already mentioned, Tori is a former Hill staff member. She worked for think tanks. She is now in the private sector, and super happy that we've got her with us today. One thing that Lee didn't touch on, Tori, is I think you mentioned that your father actually had a tool and die business back in Michigan. And so you're really familiar with kind of the auto industry and the auto supplier side of things. And if I'm not mistaken, he also made some choppers at some point, or made a chopper or two.
Yeah. So my dad, he's a career entrepreneur. And so when I was young, started his own tool and die company. So he makes parts for machines that make car parts principally. And, you know, as a Michigander, that's the auto sector is just like in your blood. Don't tell my dad I drive a foreign car. But I think it's made here in the US anyways, even if it is a foreign automaker. But yeah, actually my dad used to have a side business where he was building custom choppers, and still has his motorcycle now that he loves to drive around.
That's awesome. Great. Well, while I get back to my list of questions here that are coming in, give me 1 second. I do want to say that one of the things we cannot do is we cannot provide any kind of information that is considered to be legal advice to folks while we're doing the presentation today. So for anyone who has questions that are of a legal nature, that's not something that we can help you out with. And we also can't get into discussions or answer questions on specific HTS codes. If you say I'm importing this widget based on this HTS code, that's not something that we can answer, but we do welcome you to please go ahead and submit your questions. Lee, can you just pull that box back up real quickly on how folks can submit their questions over to the right there in the box where it says, welcome, we're glad you're here, and we'll get to you shortly. Feel free to put your questions in there and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can today during the time that's allotted to us. So Tori, first question just for you. President Trump has said that he's kind of going with his gut on things. When people asked him about how are you kind of coming up with what tariff amounts are going to be, what the length of time is going to be, what the pauses are going to be, what are you using for this? He has indicated that he's going with his gut, and the on again, off again tariffs really doesn't seem to have an end game for it. And he's articulated, he hasn't been able to articulate what a good end game is. So this makes a lot of folks really kind of nervous, and for our members, it makes it very difficult for us to plan for our future. Some people are actually thinking that President Trump, his end game is to secure more favorable trade deals and do this on kind of one-off basis around the world. Yet other people say that what he wants revenue generation for the federal government. He has indicated that we're going to make America rich again, and this would be used to pay for other things, whether it's tax cuts or other buying down the debt, reducing the amount of U.S. debt that we have. Just want to get, what are your thoughts on that? Where do you think he's actually going with all of this, and any idea as to what the end game might actually be?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Scott. And I think what you demonstrate with your question is actually what's happening within the White House actively. So there are different individuals within the president's orbit that want to have revenue generation be a primary driver. They have this idea that before the income tax existed, that the US government was largely funded through tariffs, which is the truth. But you have to remember, you also had a federal government that was substantially smaller than it is today. And right now, it would not be possible to have the US government funded solely on tariffs unless you were to dramatically decrease. And by dramatically, I mean like have the federal government be like a tenth of the size that it is today. That sort of dramatic decrease. So there are those folks who some people refer to as rebasing the way in which the United States collects taxes. There's another section of people within the president's orbit who are interested in making deals. And the president himself also is interested in making deals. And those being deals that help to increase US market access, which are important. I know specifically for the motorcycle industry, this is one that has a lot of protection in countries around the world, especially in Southeast Asia and India. It's really hard sometimes to export US motorcycles and side-by-sides and all kinds of different off-road products. So that's also part of the motivation as well. But right now, these entities, these factors are kind of coming to a head and are having these competing interests that ultimately result in what can be perceived as a relatively erratic rollout of the tariffs.
Yeah. So, I mean, what we're hearing in the industry as a result of this already is that some people are, you're seeing some supply chain disruptions that are going on. Nobody wants to import something that, costs 145% more than it did a couple of weeks ago into the United States. Some companies have actually paused either manufacturing or bringing in motorcycles from China and from other countries to, in China's case, to the 145% tariff. Higher prices really go against what the Trump administration, in one of his primary campaign pledges that he made, which was to reduce the cost of goods, reduce the cost of groceries, reduce inflation, everything from eggs to automobiles, right? So as prices continue to rise during this time, what sort of pressure does that put on the Trump administration? And do you think that they've got the stomach to actually see this through, or just how do you think it goes?
Well, I think at the outset, it's really important to distinguish the difference between price increases and inflation. So there's a difference between a company saying, we're having this increase in our fixed costs, and so we're going to have to increase our prices to consumers, and the data over time from the US government showing a sustained increase in prices based on a certain basket of goods. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing that I would point out is that actually inflation as a number has a lag. So policies that are implemented today probably won't show up in those numbers for like 2 or 3 months. And it may be even longer. And so it takes some time to be able to see the evidence of those actions. And ultimately, with this erratic behavior, it could potentially take even longer for it to show up in those economic indicators. The one thing I think that is a pressure point for the administration, aside from inflation, though, is the stock market and specifically the bond market. Two very important things, of course, and not just for people on Wall Street, right? But also for you and me, for our 401ks, for our retirements, for anyone retiring right now, drawing on their 401k. All of these things are really important indicators. And the bond market, the value of the U.S. dollar, these are all things that motivate the administration and could potentially impact their willingness to change course.
Yeah, great points. I mean, when you think about the stock market, that was really kind of Trump's measuring stick by which he measured his first administration, right? I mean, every chance he could get to go to in front of the cameras and talk about how high the stock market was at this time or that time was just kind of, taking credit for all of that. This is a very different situation right now where, people are looking at their 401ks or not looking at them because they don't want to be depressed. I'm not
looking at mine right now. I have a long time before I retire.
The market's up. I'm a little closer to the retirement thing, so the market's up a little bit today, but still significant losses for folks who are kind of at my age bracket, I would say. But the tariffs are really taxes that are imposed, and they're being imposed in this case unilaterally by the president under the IEEPA process. And we're starting to see some fissures on the Hill where folks are really not pleased with this, right? So you've seen some fissures in the Senate where they're upset. The House and others are now beginning to speak, whether it's off the record or maybe even some on the record now, about their unhappiness with the Trump administration and President Trump usurping what they, and quite honestly, the Constitution, see as the role of Congress, right? The Constitution states that that's the role of Congress. And as I mentioned in my opener, President Trump is the first one to use this particular process to raise tariffs. Do you see congressional Republicans maybe at some point exerting some influence on this topic? And do you see that the pending lawsuits that are out there right now with regard to challenging whether or not this is constitutionally valid, that those lawsuits are going to impact Congress or Trump's ability to, say, negotiate trade deals going forward?
Really, really excellent question. So I'll take the Congress part first. So many people probably don't know this, but right now, members of Congress are not in DC. They're actually back home in their states, in their districts, and they've been home now for, it'll be 2 weeks total. So they're home through this week. This is the Easter and Passover break for members. And before that, they were here in DC for quite a long period of time, especially the folks in the Senate who have been here in DC for several weeks. And so what that means is that these folks are at home, they're having town halls, they're interacting with local government officials, they're interacting with constituents more actively and more on a face-to-face, one-to-one basis than they were while they were here in the city. And that has an impact. So I'm actually really curious to see how the dynamics will change when members come back next week and when they're up in front of the press, when they're bopping around DC. But ultimately, I think we will potentially see more public action by these members, especially if over the next few days you don't see the Trump administration announce new deals. If there aren't any deals, the stock market's getting worse. People are hearing more and more from their constituents. People are hearing about businesses and their new tariff bills that they're getting from customs. That pressure will grow, and you'll potentially start to hear more of a chorus. But in the meantime, there are lots of conversations happening behind closed doors, at the staff level, between congressional staff and staff in the White House. The president very frequently calls different members of Congress to, pull their leg about their team losing a sports event, or to talk about the Masters or whatever. And in those sorts of conversations, that's where members sometimes pull in different issues. And so I can imagine there are many of those conversations happening a little bit more subliminally with the president as well, and that chorus will also grow when members come back from recess. On the second part of your question about the lawsuits, absolutely, these play a huge, huge role. You probably have heard about the one from California. You probably heard about the one from this company called Simplified, which is like a paper company. There's another new one that was just filed with the U.S. Court of International Trade, which is a domestic court that oversees trade disputes and trade issues. All of these are incredibly important. Many of these lawsuits are actually calling for an injunction, so for a temporary stoppage of the tariffs. And as the courts review over the next couple of months these different lawsuits, I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see some action, and I would say there's anywhere from a 60-40 to a 70-30 chance that one of these lower courts could rule against the administration. Now, ultimately, then that leads to a lengthy legal process with appeals back and forth, maybe even something like this going to the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, perhaps we could see a temporary injunction on the orders themselves. And then that actually kind of undermines the premise for the negotiations that are taking place, because these countries are coming to the table because they have a gun at their head of 20, 30, 40% tariffs they could potentially have to pay in 90 days or be subject to in 90 days, which ultimately, like you said before, we are the ones paying that. It's a self-inflicted gun. But ultimately, without those tariffs in place, I'm curious how many of the countries will say, you know what, actually, we're not really willing to strike a deal. So the administration's on a huge clock. They have to strike these deals, strike while the iron is hot before the courts come in and maybe make them change course.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to your first point of members being on recess the last 2 weeks, Lee mentioned my 35 years I've been doing this stuff. 18 of those years was for a member of Congress. First 4 years I was his district director, right, in Michigan. So every time the congressman came back on those breaks, I was traveling around with him to the various town halls and various meetings that you were doing. And that was the first question he would ask when he would get there was, what are you hearing so far? And then we'd go out, and usually the constituents would be amplifying exactly what you had relayed to the member. But then the last 14 years was as the chief of staff out here, and every time the congressman came back out, it was, oh, here's what and if I wasn't with him, here's what I heard. And that is absolutely an excellent point to say, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the very end of the presentation when we have a call to action and what folks can do. But to have that voice heard during these recesses is super important. And then the legal aspects of things, those are both two different kind of distinct paths for trying to slow things down here with regard to the tariffs. You mentioned at the end of your response individual countries. And so our manufacturers are really interested in a number of countries around the world, because we've got literally a global supply chain and a global manufacturing chain that we've got. But many of those countries like Vietnam, Thailand, India, Japan, the European Union, these are all significant markets for us of where we're getting our goods from. Where do you see those countries and regions heading in terms of trade deals and or potential reciprocal tariffs?
Yeah, so I would say first and foremost, Japan and India. I just saw some reporting today that actually those deals may be the best baked, so the furthest along, and they could even be imminent in an announcement. Now, I think that how robust those deals look remain to be seen. Right now, there hasn't been a lot of time to negotiate, and you're also dealing with an agency, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, which is a very small, lean agency. There's only about 300 people who work there. And so they're very much understaffed in being able to negotiate simultaneously with 90 countries around the world. But ultimately, I would say that Japan and India really, really far along, could potentially see an announcement within days. After that, the EU, recently the president of Italy was just in DC meeting with the administration. They have a very good relationship, and that is potentially promising But the EU actually just announced that they refuse to decouple with China in any sort of deal with the administration. And that is going to be a big ask, and is a big ask by the administration as they're going out and negotiating these trade deals. They want to say, okay, not only do we want you to drop your tariffs, and give us market access, but we also want you to start cutting your ties with China. And decoupling is very, very difficult, especially for countries like Vietnam and Thailand and Southeast Asia, and even India. Vietnam said that they are, glad to be negotiating with the United States, but that they would be preventing any negative impact on other markets. That is squarely saying China without saying China. So Vietnam is very cognizant of the fact that they're trying to play both sides. Thailand was actually supposed to meet here in DC tomorrow, but their meetings got postponed and they have not yet been officially scheduled. So that tells you where Thailand is currently, and maybe a little bit behind the eight ball. But ultimately, that China relationship is going to be a really, really difficult one to continue to maintain. And basically, the Chinese and the United States are trying to make countries pick sides to create this like bipolar world, in competition between the two, and it's a really, really difficult choice for folks to make.
Absolutely. I mean, when you take a look at, everybody's trying to game out who blinks first, right? Is Trump going to blink first? Is she going to blink first? And so far, she is completely ignoring Trump's, calls to urges to, call him and let's start talking about this. And she doesn't want to be seen as the kind of the weaker of the two parties, right? Neither one of these guys wants to blink, which is incredibly frustrating. You mentioned Vietnam, for example. Vietnam has already cut some deals where they've given approval to Elon Musk's Starlink, right, to operate in the country. They've approved some of Trump's business transactions that he's got going on there. Other countries that she is kind of working on, besides Vietnam, he's working on Malaysia, Cambodia, others kind of in the region there to try to carve them off and separate them from the United States, which, as you indicate, is not really working yet. But I think that everybody wants to be seen as listening to both of these leaders and trying to give each of them a little bit. How do you see it kind of playing out? Who do you think actually does blink first?
Well, yeah, you characterize this perfectly, Scott. It's really a giant game of chicken, between the United States and China, and someone's going to have to swerve. Otherwise, there will be a crash and both economies will be worse off. And right now, I feel like we're getting really close to that. It feels like a higher temperature between the US and China than it was during the first Trump administration. And, if past is prologue, you could potentially see China blink first. They do have a relatively weak economy, an aging population, and difficulty with their housing markets, with their debt. There are a lot of issues with the Chinese economy, but the United States economy is not without cracks either, as we previously discussed. So it's hard to see. I would anticipate that whenever a coming to the table happens, both sides will probably say that they were the ones who didn't blink. And there will be this messaging of like saying the other person did, or the other, you know what I mean? But ultimately, there will have to be a coming together. It could take months, though. Honestly, it's probably not going to be a quick thing.
Yeah, and there's a lot of folks who are really kind of nervous about how this ends up, right? So China, for example, has 90% of the Earth's rare earth minerals, and I think they're the second largest holder of U.S. debt in the world, next to maybe Japan. I think they own something like $800 billion worth of U.S. debt. There's concern that they may call that debt, that they've already put restrictions, right, on the rare earth minerals and some of the exports of those. And some say that the nuclear option would be to go ahead and call some of that debt or cash in some of that debt and stop off all rare earth materials. Rare earth materials are critical for us in everything from paints to computer screens to microchips to technologies on our nuclear weapons and all of our weapons systems. They're absolutely critical to us on all kinds of different levels. So do you see them actually completely banning the export of rare earth minerals or cashing in their debt?
Well, I mean, I think that it's kind of playing with fire for China and for the United States. Like we're doing things that are inflicting harm on ourselves. And China, through their retaliation, they're doing things that are inflicting harm on their own economy as well. And yes, okay, maybe they want to hold on to their rare earths, but at the same time, then they're not making money off of that. And that doesn't help with their economy either. The same thing is true when it comes to the holding of US debt. It's really important for China, which they peg their currency on a basket of currencies, but the US dollar is one of them. So it's really important for them, for the stability of their own monetary policy, to hold on to that debt, but also to have those treasury bonds because they're really usually a very safe investment. And so if there's anything that ever happens to the Chinese economy, if they have a crash, they have to be able to trade in US dollars. They have to be able to have US dollars in reserves. If they're because the US dollar is the primary currency around the world, the default currency around the world. So it's certainly playing with fire and going too far. They can make these threats, but ultimately the United States may call their bluff because it may do too much harm to them than they can handle. The difference, though, that I think is important to point out between the US and China here when it comes to self-inflicted harm is that the United States is a capitalist country. China is a communist country. There's a big difference when it comes to the accountability that you have with your electorate when you are in a capitalist system versus a communist system. So maybe that gives China a leg up, maybe it doesn't.
For sure. Well, that makes me feel better. Better than I did before I asked the question. So, one of the huge goals of the tariffs by President Trump is to just return manufacturing here to the United States, right? We've seen so much manufacturing that has left over the decades, usually low-tech manufacturing, things like sewing and garment workers and things like that that have not been, and some of the kind of basic manufacturing that has moved offshore. But China is also really good in high-tech manufacturing as well. And I'm wondering, is it reasonable to think that industries are actually going to return to the United States and return all of that manufacturing to the United States? And is there even a workforce here now to have those, folks and come back and kind of work in those kind of plants? So there's all these memes that you're seeing going around on social media of fat old guys like me that are sewing intricate little things like in a factory in China, and I just don't see that kind of coming back here to the United States. We've shifted far more to kind of tech and industry, the tech industry type stuff, services, education as an export from the United States, right? People coming here getting a great education. All of those things are actually counted as exports from the United States. So you think that they can actually achieve what they want to achieve with the return of manufacturing?
Well, so Scott, you point out a good point when you say manufacturing jobs are down in the US. That is true. But what's not true is manufacturing is not down or dead in the United States. This is such a misnomer. It's such a misrepresentation of the data. Actually, manufacturing output, the value of manufacturing goods that we produce every year in the United States, has grown exponentially over the last several decades. So just a couple of statistics for you. In 2005, US manufacturing output was equal to $4.6 trillion. In 2024, that was $7.3 trillion. You're talking about a substantial increase. We're producing more, it's higher value than it ever has been before. And so this idea that manufacturing is dead in the US, it's just not quite true. It's just that we're manufacturing different things. But we're still doing so much manufacturing. We're still such a powerhouse. We're also a powerhouse in design and in technology. As you point out, the other thing is that because of technology and innovation, manufacturing is a lot more productive in the United States, more efficient than it is overseas. We have higher technology. We have, rather than people physically, using machines, we're using robots and we're using higher tech materials to make our goods. And that's the big difference. So manufacturing is not dead in the United States. It's just different than it looked 40 years ago. And that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. That means that more people are working in safer environments, more highly educated, more advanced society than we were. And that is really, really good for human flourishing. Now, when it comes to sectors maybe that will grow, they'll be the same sectors that have been growing. Rather than having textiles and weavers and people making fabric, you're having people, make this iPhone right here, right? You're having people make high-tech goods and design those high-tech goods is actually the higher value portion of the content of the good. So we are creating more economic activity by doing the research and development and design and all these, maybe making components or doing final assembly here in the US than we are with some of the like manufacturing of lower value goods. We're doing more for the US economy.
Yeah, back when I was at the Export-Import Bank as an appointee over there, in my previous life before coming over to the Powersports industry, we exported a ton of services. We financed the export of a lot of engineering services and things like that, education services. So totally agree with you. And I'll have to share your response with Jay Timmons over at National Association of Manufacturers, because I think you're spot on with the response there. So you mentioned 90 different countries around the world. I know that I'm looking at like 70 countries around the world that President Trump has said that he's going to negotiate new trade deals with, right, over the 90-day pause period that he's got there. And if my math is correct, that equates to roughly, if they're working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's like churning out a new trade agreement every 30 hours or so. And that's just not going to happen, right? These trade agreements take years and years. You and I have both worked in this field for a long time. We know how long those take to actually come about. But where do you see the first deals actually being struck, and what do you think the scope of those deals will be? And you mentioned Vietnam, for example. Maybe that's one of the first ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think that right now, as I'm, reading the tea leaves, it looks like Japan and India could be the first to strike, but I think that the scope of those deals may be smaller than we would anticipate. They're not going to be full-scale trade agreements like the USMCA. They're probably going to be smaller scale, but ultimately create an opening or a forum for future negotiations to take place to help lower additional barriers. After that, I think the United Kingdom is up there probably in the list of countries that could get an early deal with the US, and then maybe Korea, because we do actually already have a free trade agreement with Korea. It's called the Chorus FTA. And then potentially the European Union. But again, there's a lot of jockeying there. And I think that different countries within the EU have different opinions on how they want to approach. Some want to retaliate hard and fast, and others want to negotiate. And ultimately, anything that happens with the EU has to be signed off by all the countries. So that's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And then after that, maybe Thailand and Vietnam, but again, with the decoupling sticking point, those are going to be really hard deals to strike. And if the administration really sticks to their guns on wanting to decrease Chinese influence more than just transshipment or counterfeit goods, like those sorts of things are a little bit easier. Maybe some state-owned enterprise provisions, but anything beyond that becomes a lot more difficult. But what I will say is it's actually really important for either these deals to be struck or for the administration to be engaging with Southeast Asia specifically because of China's influence in the region. We're not in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The United Kingdom is, but we're not in some of these regional trade agreements that allow for increased trade to take place. And so without that, and China does have a lot of agreements with these countries. So to counterbalance that, we really need to be active in the region.
Yeah, you mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and back when I was at the Export-Import Bank, if I was part of those negotiations that were going on when we were trying to join the TPP, and if I had a dime for every minute that I spent in a skiff in the Situation Room over at the White House during those months and months that we were negotiating that and got very close to doing it, I would be able to offset the losses that I've had in the stock market so far under the administration here. So
there you go.
I'm not seeing more questions on my screen here. Andrea, let me go to you and just make sure that if you got other questions that we got about 8 minutes left here. We need a couple minutes at the end just to kind of do the call to action. So.
Okay, Scott, I've actually got a bunch of questions coming in now, fast and furious, probably over 100 of them, so we won't get to all. But can you talk a little bit again about how, when we were talking about manufacturing, bringing sort of, one of the goals is to bring manufacturing back to the US. Have you seen any efforts at the government level, maybe building back manufacturing US, subsidizing, or perhaps any incentives?
That's a really good question. So I'd say the administration's first goal is to extend, hopefully permanently, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So this is the big tax bill that was passed during the first Trump administration. A lot of those provisions, this is things like being able to deduct your research and development expenses, bonus depreciation for the equipment that you're buying, business interest deduction, which basically allows you to deduct the interest that you pay on your loan. So if you are financing that equipment that you're purchasing, being able to deduct that from your tax bill. All of these things have either expired or they've become less taxpayer friendly. And so that's a huge priority of the administration. And actually right now in Washington, when members come back from recess, the House is going to start holding hearings and markups on what's called the reconciliation package, which is how they are attempting to extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So that absolutely a huge boon. What that means for you is that you'll, as a business, right, that means you could potentially have a lower tax bill, but that comes with having to incentivize increasing your research and development and other activities to help grow your business. More than that, there have been conversations about on the individual side, reducing taxes on tips, reducing taxes on overtime pay, potentially reducing the corporate tax rate for manufacturers. So these are all things that are actively being discussed in Washington that would be taxpayer friendly actions to try to decrease that burden on manufacturers.
Thank you, Tori. Scott, both you and Tori also touched on the fact that of exemptions, and maybe if you could just reiterate this again, because there are a couple questions about, are there any exemptions or discussions of exemptions, maybe for component parts that are made, final assembly in the U.S. Also, some asked about, like, some are claiming a Chapter 98 agricultural exemption to a previous tariff. Does that still apply? And then if the exemptions, the elimination of the exemption only apply to shipments for China, or is it to everywhere?
Go ahead, Tori, if you want.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you probably remember during the first Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about exemptions. The administration was using more narrow tools than they're using now, which Scott talked about at the beginning of the talk with Section 232, Section 301. These are certainly more narrow, have more of a transparent process and investigation process to engage in. And so through that, individuals or companies that were impacted by the tariffs could petition the administration to have their products exempt. A lot of that happened for things that are just not available outside of the country in question. So you could get an exemption from the 301s if your product wasn't available anywhere but China. Or same thing with the steel and aluminum tariffs. If you were looking for a specialty product that just is only available from one place, that is not the conversation this time around. Part of that is because the administration is using this tool that has an underpinning of a national emergency. And so their view that they communicate is that having exemptions would undermine the argument of the national emergency. And so I think that as we move down the process, depending on, what happens with the lawsuits that we talked about earlier, how the public sentiment is surrounding the tariffs going forward, that could potentially change the tune a little bit. The last time around, the exemption process started happening because Congress spoke up and because Congress requested it. And so ultimately it could happen, but right now the administration is not signaling any willingness to do broad exemptions.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is on the electronics, consumer electronics, computers, that kind of stuff. The president did indicate that he was starting a 232 process, kind of that more narrow process that was done in his first term for those particular products. So there might be opportunities where he just kind of, that's how he could back away a little bit and save face, is just kind of transition over from IEEPA over into 232 or 301. So.
Yeah, and think about that as in like everything is being hit by IEEPA, everything's being hit by these big overarching tariffs, but maybe they're moving certain sectors into separate buckets, separate treatment. So they're still using these tools and making arguments that national security is of concern, but they're going through processes that take a long time. They could take up to 270 days. I mean, that's the better part of a year. And so that one creates a transparent process, but two also slows things down a little bit, and is also a process that is a lot stickier. So if you recall, we still have the 232 tariffs in place today, the Trump administration put in place during their first term. And so they can really have a lot more duration than potentially what we're currently looking at with IEEPA right now.
Great point. Andrea, we could probably do one more and then we need to jump to the call to action if we could, and try to answer other folks' questions maybe at a later time. So.
Okay, and actually this might lead you right into it. Are there any strategies that the MIC has to possibly fight these tariffs?
Yeah, so great question. There's not the process that we have under 232 and 301. So really our strategy has been to do the Capitol Hill Flyin, right? We did the Capitol Hill Flyin. As part of that, if you look on your screen now, you see the Contact Congress button that we've got on our landing page, and the economic impacts you'll see over on the right there of the 50.9 billion. If you click on that economic impact, you can get economic impact sheets for all 50 states and the United States. If you click on the Contact Congress to oppose the tariffs, that'll bring you into an automated system. We've got a letter that's already written for you to talk about what the costs are to the industry and what the effects are that we're having. You see the process there on how you can send a letter. So you click on the first one, it brings you to the advocacy page. You click on that, it brings you up to where you put in your information. It'll blow in automatically to your member of Congress and make sure that the letters get to your member of Congress in particular. The second thing that you can do is to invite your congressmen and senators to come and visit your business. So Tori talked about how they've been on recess the last 2 weeks. There's a couple other recesses that will happen that are shorter term ones between now and August. Then for the entire month of August, essentially, they're looking at being back in the district or in their state for a district work period for the month of August. And you can invite the member of Congress. You can, first of all, you can go to their office and let them know, their regional office that they might have in your hometown or near your hometown, and let their staff know what your views are on the issue. But the other is that you can invite them to come out and visit your business, right? If you're if you've got a cycle gear shop that you manage and you bring them out to the shop and you show them the tariffs, all the things, the tariffs on the various products that are coming in for our industry, huge impact. If you're a manufacturer and you bring them to your manufacturing facility, they can get the idea that, oh, we are still doing the manufacturing or assembling here in the United States, but there's still the impact of all of those inputs that are being brought in that manufacturing or assembly process are being tariffed as they're coming into the country, minimum of 10%, maximum of 145, depending on where they're coming in from right now. So that's the other way that you can help to fight the tariffs. That really is the best strategy that we've got right now, because if you stick your head up and if the industry got out there and started just screaming about President Trump and saying that he's terrible and these tariffs are terrible and being very vocal about it, that you risk being hit back with some significant punishment from the administration. But members of Congress, they are the ones who really need to understand what that impact is, because President Trump is looking at the national and or global impact of the tariffs. whereas each member of Congress is looking at his or her district. And if a member comes in and she says to the president, this is what's happening in my district, this is not good, this is costing us jobs in my district, the president eventually is going to listen to that. And as Tori talked about, whether it's calling somebody about what their latest thing was for their sports team, or giving them the business, or just calling on to say, hey, how are things going, or you're a really important chairman or subcommittee chairman, I want you to make sure that you're kind of holding the line for us. Those people are going to let the president know what they're hearing. So that's absolutely the best way you can do it, is to click on that link that we've got there, submit those comments, and then secondly, invite members to come to your facility during the recess periods.
And Scott, if I can just add there, I just came from Capitol Hill working for Senator Blackburn from Tennessee, and I can tell you that engagement like this is directly reviewed not only by the member's staff, but also is reported to the member regularly. And so when there's a big influx that happens on a particular issue, or let's say that the member is getting ready to have a big hearing, or to meet with a particular group that's coming into town in DC, they look back at this that intake of letters and messages, and they do have an impact. And in the office that I was in specifically, there was a weekly email that the senator got that actually she would engage and reply to at times, that would tell her how many people each week have called in on a particular issue, how many people have written letters on a particular issue. So they see it, and it really does make an impact.
Great points, Tori. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time today and for being here. Really appreciate your expertise and your view on these things. Thank your partners over there at Forbes Tate for allowing you to spend the hour with us, and I'm sure many hours in preparing for it before that. But on behalf of everybody on the line, thank you so much for your presentation. Lee, I'll turn it back over to you for how folks can take additional action.
Sounds great. Scott and Tori, thank you so much. It certainly can't be easy keeping an eye on all this, but we sure appreciate all you're doing. Regarding the call to action that Scott mentioned, we'll be sending you an email shortly. Keep an eye out in your inbox. That email is going to have a link that you can use to easily contact your lawmakers and take a stand against tariffs. It only takes 3 minutes to complete, but your contribution can have a lasting impact. So keep an eye out. Just won't be very shortly here in your inbox. There were a lot of questions submitted today, and we certainly couldn't get through all of them. If we didn't get to yours, please feel free to send us an email at info@mic.org. And if you're not a member of your industry's trade association, the Motorcycle Industry Council, please consider signing up today. As a member, you'll be part of a unified voice working to protect and grow the powersports industry through advocacy, research, and collaboration. So stay engaged, make a difference. Join the MIC today. And don't forget to subscribe to your industry's weekly newsletter, the MIC Ride Report. Stay up to date with everything powersports. Well, that concludes our symposium. Thank you again for being here. We'll see you next time.